Welcome to the Missionary Mobilization Podcast, a resource for Christian leaders who want to increase the number of missionaries around the world. This podcast is a ministry of the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention at Trinity Bible College and Graduate School. Visit us online at missionarymobilization.org. Now, here's your host, the founder and director of the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention, David Jacob.
Well, Merry Christmas, everyone, and welcome to the show. Our goal is to equip and encourage mobilizers and missions pastors from around the world. Please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app. And if you would give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, that would help us reach more listeners. We'd also love it if you could share this podcast with a friend. And please let us know how you like the podcast or if you have any suggestions for show topics. Just email us at hello@missionarymobilization.org. One listener recently wrote to us and said, "Your podcast episode on the disabled involved in missions was excellent. I am blind and have gradually lost my eyesight. My wife and I have served cross-culturally for the last 18 years or so, primarily in the areas of church planting and community development. Thanks for propping up the mission of God through those whom society, and oftentimes the church at large, has written off." Well, if our podcast has been a blessing to you or your organization, would you consider partnering with us to finish the year strong? Simply visit missionarymobilization.org/support to help us continue resourcing Christian leaders around the world. Well, our topic for today is mobilizing people to the unreached, and our guest is Dr. Marvin Newell. Dr. Newell is staff missiologist for Missio Nexus, a network of evangelical mission agencies, churches, and training centers in North America, and he's the newly appointed executive director of Alliance for the Unreached. Previously, he served as a missionary to Indonesia. Marv is the author of 4 mission-related books and holds a Doctorate of Missiology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Marv, welcome to the program today.
David, thank you so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation together.
Well, I am as well. It's a passion of mine is mobilizing people to the unreached, and I'm so glad that you're the new executive director of the Alliance for the Unreached. And I wonder if we could just start by maybe you telling us a little bit about how the Alliance for the Unreached began, and maybe just explain what it is for those listeners who may not know about it.
Why, sure, I'd be glad to. The Alliance for the Unreached is indeed just that, an alliance or a network of mission agencies and concerned people that want to reach the unreached of the world. And therefore, they've bound together in this alliance in order to help mobilize people and resources so that they will be able to be sent out to unreached peoples that still remain in the world today. So that's what the Alliance is all about. And people can go to our website, alliancefortheunreached.org, and learn more about it there. But you asked me a second question, Dave, and let me tell you the history of this alliance. It actually came into being 5 years ago, back in October of 2015, in the offices of Reach Beyond, which is one of the mission agencies that's a founding member of the Alliance. It's interesting that earlier in 2015, Reach Beyond published what they call a manifesto for the unreached, and it has like 7 points about wanting to engage all resources for reaching the unreached. And this manifesto was passed around in mission circles. It came to us at Missio Nexus, and we saw it there. And then they followed up and said, hey, maybe we need to actually do something about this together. And so they called a meeting at their offices in October 2015. And about 7 organizations showed up, and we just talked about what it would take to reach the remaining unreached peoples of the world and to mobilize the American church for that. And with that we came up with a day that was called International Day for the Unreached. We just said, let's start by just having a day, a special day. And why not the day of Pentecost? Every year, the day of Pentecost. And so that's why the day is different every year. because we do pin it right on the day of Pentecost, the day when the Holy Spirit came down on the church in order to empower it to go out and reach the world. It just seemed like the ideal day for us to focus on unreached people groups. And so starting with 2016 and right up to now, every year we are indeed holding the International Day for the Unreached as one of the main things that we do. But we do much more than that. But that's our main event, is to get churches mobilized one day a year to focus on the unreached.
Excellent. I love that. And, it just shows what God can do when people come together and say, how can we collaborate on this initiative? And so incredible beginnings. And we at the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention here are happy to be a member of the Alliance for the Unreached to spread the word and to really help people understand and to educate them on who the unreached are and why we should focus on them. So let's start there for a minute. What do you consider to be an unreached people group? There are several definitions floating around. So how does the Alliance and or Missio Nexus define an unreached people group?
Dave, you are so right. There are several definitions. There's multiple definitions. So no one has come to a consensus on how you define unreached people. Some groups like to use percentages of people that are not aware of the gospel, and others would rather talk about no access. And one of the definitions I gravitate to a lot comes actually from David Platt, and he's written on this, and he said that a good way to define the unreached peoples are peoples and places among whom Christ is largely unknown and the church is relatively insufficient to make Christ known in its broader population without outside help. And I think that encapsulates two things there: geography and people groups, where there's just such limited access to the gospel that the gospel is not able to penetrate into those villages, those towns, those cities. It's just not available there at that place. So, in a technical way, that's a definition I like to use. But Dave, let me say this. There's also a more popular way of looking at it that I think our church people, when we talk about this in our churches, maybe are able to handle much better. And that's where we talk about the 3 no's. And the 3 no's as well, there's no church in a particular people group. There is no Bible either translated, or it might be translated, but it's not even distributed. And there's no believers, or there's very few believers. And just using the word no helps to emphasize that the access is very, very, very minimal, if any access at all. And after serving years in Indonesia myself, I know of large geographic areas where the 3 no's exist in the fullest extent. There's no church and no Bible and no believers, and they're just embedded in the majority religion of that country, and they're isolated in geographic areas that it's hard to really get the gospel to penetrate up into that area. And Bible translation may not, or maybe has or not been started there, but the vast majority of people there would have not a clue of it. And if they did have a clue, they could care less. They could just care less that the Bible is there. So, we can look at the task in these 2 different ways. We can try to define it down rather technically, or we may use the no's. But, probably the best thing to do is just to talk about access, that there's just no access to the gospel to the common person in those areas. And so that's the word that we really gravitate to and use a lot in our Alliance, that there's no access to the Bible, to the gospel, meaning the Bible, and believers aren't there, and there's no church. No gospel access is just a good way of putting it. And if I could take that on just a little bit further, David, I know you got other things you want to ask me. We at the Alliance are coming up with, and we're going to start promoting next year, actually a mark to use, which is called a third of us, where we're going to talk about 1/3 of humanity having no access to the gospel. And that's going to make it really easy for, I think, the rank and file of Christians to identify with, oh, there's 1/3 of humanity, there's 1/3 of us that has no access. And so that's just a good way of helping people to visualize without getting really technical about percentages and so forth of what the need is in the world.
Yes, and we'll be sure to put a link to that website so that people can get more information, because these definitions are so important. I once met a youth pastor who said that he was a missionary to an unreached people group because he was the chaplain of the local hockey team in upstate New York. And so, that just confuses people. And so it's very important that we have distinct definitions.
Could I speak to that for a moment, David?
Yeah,
because
please.
We do hear that a lot. And I hear it from Christians in my circle too. Even my brother, who was a high school teacher, said, well, I had unreached people in my class, although it's a very heavily churched area there. And so what we can say is this, is with confidence here in America, people have full access to the gospel. There's full gospel access, of course, through Bible, the variety of Bibles, the radio programs, churches abound and all like that. And so we need to talk about, access to the gospel gives people opportunity. And they have the opportunity to believe that gospel, to reject that gospel, or to ignore it. But they have access to it. And so we're not talking about people in America when we talk about no access to the gospel. We're talking about those other places overseas where there's actually 3.2 billion people. And that's a big number, 3.2 billion people that wouldn't have any of that. There's no access to the gospel. And so we're making distinctions between unbelievers and unreached.
Yeah, that's good. It's so similar to the concept, if someone in that people group, someone of that ethnicity, any ethnicity, were to want to learn about Christianity, they wanted to know what Christianity was about, do they have people or the Bible or the church to be able to explain to them what Christianity is? If the answer is yes to those things, then they are probably most likely not an unreached people group. And so it is this issue of access, and do they have these things? And so I don't know about you, but I often have a hard time helping some of my students understand this concept. And one of the things that hits home is that I am so glad that I was born in a people group that was reached. And if I was born in an unreached people group, knowing what I know now about Christianity, I would certainly want people to focus, I would want believers and missionaries to focus on unreached people groups. And so what are some other reasons why we should focus on UPGs, unreached people groups?
Well, we could use the word fairness to give people the fair chance to hear the gospel, if we like. And David, at the beginning of this program, you said Merry Christmas to everybody. What if we were to visualize a person out shopping in a shoe store, and he goes in the shoe store, and there's 100 pairs of shoes on the rack around this big shoe store, but they were the people in the shoe store said, we got 40 of the pair of shoes there on the back shelf and along the back side there, but we don't want you to shop back there. Just shop the other 60 pairs of shoes that we have up here. But you see back there that there might be some shoes that you really would want to buy. This is kind of taking it just the opposite direction of saying that, oh, you're preventing access to 40% of your stock. Why would you do that? Well, why would we do that when it comes to people groups? Why would we deny access to 40% of the people, in the store, you might say, that would have legitimate right to have someone come to them and to look at them and to purchase that pair of shoes, or that, to, as far as people group, to be able to interact with them. But we would shy away from that. And so, it's just another way of looking at it visually, that it just isn't fair to think that after 2,000 years, we would still have this many segments of humanity that do not have an opportunity to have access to the gospel.
Hmm. Yeah, and in relation to that, there's been some articles that have been published in recent years, and I know I even have colleagues and friends of mine that take the position that we should not focus on unreached people groups, that perhaps we should be led by the Spirit, or go where the Lord is leading us, and that we maybe shouldn't strategize to place missionaries amongst certain people groups. So, how would you respond to that type of argument?
Well, David, I think the argument boils down to two things. First of all, a biblical answer from Scripture, and also an anthropological answer that many times people that don't live overseas don't understand. And let's start with the biblical answer. And first of all, starting with Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, and when that's translated into English, it talks, about Abraham being a blessing to all the nations, and that's translated in Greek to all the ethne, all the Pontatai ethne. And so we get the phrase started right there, where God was wanting to give a blessing through Abraham to all the peoples. And the blessing is Jesus, by the way. The blessing is Jesus to all the nations, that Abraham would be a blessing to all nations. The only way he could be a blessing is because of Jesus being the Savior of all of mankind. You take that over to Matthew chapter 28, and verses 19 and 20 of the last chapter there talks about Jesus saying that we are to make disciples of, once again, all the ethnic group. And that word there can be translated Gentiles. I understand that, just generally Gentiles or nations in that way. But really, when you compare it with other pieces of Scripture, you go to Luke chapter 24, and the Great Commission passage there. Once again, Jesus said to go to the ethne, and then you tie that into Revelation chapter 5, verses 7 through 9, where it talks about people from every people, tribe, tongue, and nation. What we're seeing is it's segmenting out as groups of peoples that are to be reached with the gospel. So I think there's a strong argument from the biblical text itself that, yes, we're to be witnessing everywhere in the world. I mean, Jesus also said in Mark chapter 16, 15, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And so, yeah, the broadness of our task is there, but then the honing down of how to do that from the strategy Jesus gave in Matthew 28 tells us to look at this in people group segments. And for those, David, like you and I that have lived overseas, I lived in Indonesia 15 years, and I lived on an island that had probably, 250 people groups in it. I mean, there's just a vast number of these people. Now, those small people groups, 10,000, 5,000 and all, but they all had their own distinct language and culture and way of living, their lives, worldviews, I guess you would say. That, yes, we could try to just spread the gospel generally around the island, but we wouldn't be hitting all the different segments that are there. In other words, mankind has been divided, and I think that God has divinely done this, into people groups, into ethno-linguistic groups that have an affinity with each other, where the gospel, if it enters into that group, can readily spread amongst those people because of the commonality that they have. And therefore, we have, someone has counted 17,000 people groups in the world, 9,000 of those with gospel access, and the other 7,000 without gospel access. Well, it just makes sense that we would look at the task of putting it into segments that are bite-sized, able to handle, and talk about unreached peoples with no access to the gospel in people groups.
Yeah, and further, the stat that really astounds me, Marv, is that 96 to 97% of our missionary force goes to where the church are places where the church already exists. And so you've got 3%, 3 to 4% of our missionary force around the world that are ministering, endeavoring to make disciples in places where there is no access. And that's such a small percentage. And so I think a lot of us are saying, let's just balance this out a little bit, right? You mentioned the Great Commission, and this is from my understanding, this is the only command of Jesus to make disciples of all ethnicities. It's the only command of Jesus that the church has never obeyed. In 2,000 years, Jesus is not obeyed, and that should disturb us. That should bother us. And furthermore, Jesus deserves worship from these people groups that he has created, and he's currently not getting worship from a third of humanity, like you mentioned earlier. And doesn't Jesus deserve that? And don't we want to work to help him get the worship that he deserves from people that he created, that he loves, that have no idea that he even exists? And so these are just some really important reasons, and I'm so glad you brought some of those up. Well, Marv, I'm wondering how missionaries and mobilizers and missions pastors that are listening today and other Christian leaders, how can they utilize some of your resources? What are just some practical ways they can do that?
Oh, yes, sure. If anyone wants to go to our website, which is alliancefortheunreached.org, I mentioned that earlier, you will see that there is a resource tab there, and there's several things that are there. There's a prayer guide as to how to pray for unreached peoples, and then there's also a guide that talks about the state of these people. And so there's these two different manuals that are there that are available, but also there's some sermon notes, some sermon outlines. There's brochures to use for your church insert bulletin. If you use a bulletin anymore, I know these days of COVID, I think that's delayed for a while, but there's these flyers that you can use, and resources like that, especially to use on the day for the International Day for the Unreached, which, by the way, Dave, is going to be May 23rd next year. So people should circle that date on their calendar, May 23. Also, there's videos there. A lot of our members have posted videos on our site, and they're really, really good videos. Now, some of them obviously are for the promotion of their ministry, which is fine, but the greater story in those videos is the no gospel access. And it's done very, very well by all of those videos that are there. And so, they could be shown, they're 2-minute videos, 3-minute, they could be shown in a church setting, in a Sunday school, a small group or whatever, would be just a way for people to visualize what it's like for these unreached areas to have no access to the gospel.
Great resources. And again, mark that day, May 23rd, on your calendars, and start planning now. Get a group of people together from your church, from your congregation, from your organization, and start planning this out in order to promote International Day of the Unreached, coming up in just 5 months or so. So, Marv, there might be churches or mission agencies listening today that are saying, "Hey, we want to get in on this alliance. How can we partner with you guys? How can we become a member? What more can we do to partner with the Alliance for the Unreached?"
Yeah, great question, Dave. And we would love to have people just kind of come on board with us. We have a category called champion members, and a church could become a champion member, or an organization a champion member, where we would list them as a champion. Now, there's a cost to that. It's just under $500 a year. But what happens is then they get recognized on our website, and we interview them and do different podcasts and so forth with them to help them to be featured in reaching the unreached. But another thing that we have is what we call advocates, a category called advocates. And this can be done for individual Christians. Say there's just one person that wants to get engaged, and you can go in and you'll see a couple of ways that you can become an advocate with us. And What we're going to start promoting at the beginning of next year, David, is for advocates, if they would just simply save $1 a week, $1 a week, that's all we're saying, $1 a week, and that's $52 a year, and send that, and there's a donate tab, you can donate that into our website, then we will make sure that that money is used for reaching unreached peoples. And so, yeah, just a minimal way, such as a small gift, $1 a week, would be helpful in helping them to be part of the process of sending people to unreached peoples. David, I like to segment churches or Christians into two groups. There's the goers and the senders, the goers and the senders. And so advocates with us could be part of the sending process, the senders that helps the goers as they go.
Yes, and it's another way that all believers can be involved and play an important role in the Great Commission. So I love that you have options for organizations like us and that you have an option for individuals as well. And so, Marv, I would love to hear some of your vision. You're new to this role as executive director for the Alliance for the Unreached, and I just would want to hear, what's next for the Alliance? What's your future vision? Can you share a little bit with us?
Well, David, we want to grow the Alliance in a way that it's just reaching the entire world so that the world can be reached with the gospel. I mean, that's the reason we're doing this. We're not trying to build ourselves up just so that we're a central kind of clearinghouse for this. We don't want to be that only, although, we would function as that. But there's a couple of things that we want to do. We want to actually bring on international groups with us. We haven't done this yet. And so one of my visions is to have international advocates join us as well. And what we would ask them to do is agree to our doctrinal statement, agree to the manifesto for the unreached, and agree to push the International Day for the Unreached Day every year. And then we would recognize them on our website. So there's a lot of alliances or networks overseas. Actually, there's hundreds of them that would be eligible to be common and be part of this and be recognized as really pushing ministry to the unreached. So one of my goals is to see if we can bring in international partners or advocates to be part of us. The other thing is that $1 a day program. We want to start running with that. We haven't really pushed that yet, and this is the first time it's being announced actually here on your podcast. But $1 a day would be a great way if we could just get hundreds of people doing $1 a week. It's $1 a week. We just think that we could then generate resources to help send the goers who are going to reach these unreached peoples.
So good, so important. I am just a huge fan, and of course we're members, and we just love partnering with you to just help Jesus receive the worship he deserves from all people groups around the world. And so, Marv, we just appreciate you sharing with us today. If our listeners would like to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Well, if they want to get in contact with me directly, they could write me at, let me give a very easy one for them to remember, at Marv Newell at gmail.com. So that's MarvNewell at gmail.com. That's the simplest email address. And I'd be glad to hear from anybody, Dave, that would write to me as a result of this podcast and see what we could do for them and getting them engaged in this movement with us.
That's excellent. And we will link to that, to Marv's email address for you. Just visit missionarymobilization.org/podcast is our podcast homepage. And so all of our show notes, all the resources that we've mentioned today will be listed there. And we'd especially like to thank Assemblies of God World Missions who helped sponsor our podcast today. You can join AGWM's pipeline to receive personal guided assistance through the process of applying for overseas missions service. The need is great, as we've talked about today, and the opportunities are endless. Visit Assemblies of God World Missions at agwm.org. Marv, again, thank you so much. What an excellent conversation, and we hope and pray that that this show today spurs many, many people to action. Thanks so much for being with us today.
It was a delight to be on. Thank you for having me, David. I deeply appreciate it.
Amen, brother. It was a lot of fun. And until next time, everyone, let's keep praying for more laborers to work in His harvest fields.
You've been listening to the Missionary Mobilization Podcast, a ministry of the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention at Trinity Bible College and Graduate School. You can access free resources online at missionarymobilization.org. Also, follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Missionary Mobilization. Thanks for listening.